today. I'm Kathy Newman in the English department, and I am in charge of the Humanities Center theme this year, which is media and social change. This is our last presentation of the fall. Just to give you a little sneak preview of the spring, our senior research fellow Leshu Torshin is going to be giving a talk on her new work on films about sort of the economic crisis. Leshu, can you just stand up, remind everybody who you are? Leshu also has a book out this month, which we will bring copies of to that talk and maybe sell and sign, which we're very excited about. I'm also thrilled to announce that Professor Nadel Phillips is going to be talking about her research where she studies how people read Jane Austen, and she paired with a bunch of scientists, and they actually did brain scans of people reading Jane Austen to figure out what does absorbed reading look like. And so I'm hoping we might get some of our friends from other parts of the university into that talk. Her work has been featured recently in the Chronicle of Higher Education and on National Public Radio. And then in April, Lee Rayford is going to be talking about civil rights and photography from her book, In a Luminous Glare. We also have the film festival coming up in March, and you'll get a lot more information about that. So right now I'm going to introduce David Shumway in the English department, the director of the Humanities Center, who will introduce our guest for today. Thank you.
So it's my great pleasure to introduce Alan Nadel, who I have known by reputation all of my academic career and personally for at least 20 years. Alan is William T. Bryan Professor in the English Department at the University of Kentucky. He teaches courses in post-World War II American literature, American film and television, and Cold War studies. He's published in an enormous range of areas. His books include Television in Black and White America, Race and National Identity, Flatlining on the Field of Dreams, Cultural Narratives in the Films of President Reagan's America, Containment Culture, American Narrative, Postmodernism and the Atomic Age, a book about Ralph Ellison. He has edited two very important volumes on August Wilson, a very important figure in this city. So an extraordinarily broad-ranging scholar. He also writes poetry, amazingly enough. And he's joining our conversation about media and social change to kind of represent the other side of that equation. Maybe today's talk will contradict this, but much of Alan's work suggests that the media inhibits social change, or if it makes social change at all, it makes bad change, like vouchers for Medicare. So, as the president said recently. So without further ado, Alan Nadel.
Suede jacket for me. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Let me just fiddle with technology. Thank you, David, for that introduction, and even more for inviting me here. This is, we've got this up there. Okay, we're up there. I don't even have to fiddle. This is part of a book that I've been working on that's been taking longer than I thought it would because other things keep coming up and intervening, including the second August Wilson volume. And more recently, a volume I'm very proud of that I co-edited with Susan Griffin, the editor of Henry James Review, called The Men Who Knew Too Much, Alfred Hitchcock and Henry James. And I feel very good about bragging about it because other people wrote most of the essays, and it's a wonderful heuristic pairing of two geniuses. We just asked authors to put together, pick one Hitchcock work and one James work and make of it what they would. So this book that I've been working on, and parts of it coming out in print, this one just came out, interestingly, in Italian, which was translated. Someone requested it for an Italian journal, and I said, okay, and then they said, well, we have to translate it, and I said, fine. So it's, if you read Italian, you can get it in Italy someplace. In any case, it's part of this book called Unintelligent Design, or How Bush Knew. And it was provoked by my agitation at the way in which no one was calling stupidity stupidity. Now, as I started to compile these essays as a book, somehow the dam burst and a lot of books came out, and pundits and comedians calling Bush stupid. But as you may recall, people kept talking about 9/11 being caused by a lack of intelligence, and I agree with that. And I just wondered at what point we could start calling a lack of intelligence stupidity. For example, the United States occupation of Japan, the planning for the United States occupation of Japan began before Pearl Harbor. Before Pearl Harbor. By the same token, when we were planning to invade Iraq, Donald Rumsfeld was on the record as threatening to fire anyone on his staff who brought up the topic of an occupation plan. Now there's a certain point where that threshold is not just a failure of intelligence, it's absolute stupidity. So I started to look at the various ways in which the notion of intelligence had played during the Bush administration, whether it was intelligent design or the intelligence community, or various kinds of knowledge or intelligence. And this is one of the chapters, or part of one of the chapters on that. And I'll just start with this. On December 19th, 2004, actor Idris Elba left the cast of The Wire when his character, Stringer Bell, was rubbed out by two assassins. At the time, Bell was in effect the chief administrative officer of the Barksdale Crime Organization. On March 19th, 2009, Elba returned to American television as Charles Miner, the office's new Dunder Mifflin regional manager, in many ways resurrecting the persona of the no-nonsense Bell. Once again, as second in charge, Miner is strict, humorless, and intimidating in his pursuit of business efficiency, just as Bell is commensurately committed to applying business principles learned in his community college economics course to the contingencies of drug dealing. Let me see, if gods are kind, this book will work.
In America, all day, spiritual community, especially when we consider it's the fight for the territory, and we bring in the bodies, and the bodies that bring up police.
Yeah, but how we gonna stand?
Yo, she ain't recognize your ass, man.
How we gonna stand on some? Come on, man. How we gonna stand on some corner that's not ours?
We got the best product, right? So the chances are we gonna be able to bring in the competition by offering them to re-up with us for an idle package. Feel me? Everybody making money sharing the real estate. It's in trouble.
What if they don't cop our re-up though?
I'm gonna worry about that when it happens. Until then, Mr. Charles, we gonna handle this shit like businessmen. Sell the shit, make the profit, and later for that gangster bullshit. Yeah.
Do the chick know we gonna look like some punk ass bitches out there?
Motherfucker, I will punk your ass
Yo,
and say some shit.
Frank.
What?
Who did that before,
Shut
man?
the fuck up, man. This nigga too ignorant to have the fucking floor. Y'all niggas need to start looking at the world in a new fucking light. Start thinking about this shit like some grown fucking men. Not some niggas off the fucking corner, you heard me? They're jailing your asses.
This reminds you of your last English department meeting. On his initial visit to the Scranton office of Dunder Mifflin, Miner eliminates the office's party budget and the party committee as inefficient uses of time and money. He thus seems to be undercutting the comic exaggeration of the office's petty tyrannies and gross incompetence, that is, its very ethos. It is almost as though the Wire's Stringer Bell has been recruited to stop the absurdities of the office.
Everyone except for Michael, go back to your desk.
Yeah, why don't you do that? Yeah, here we go.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, Michael, we're dissolving this committee.
What?
Yeah, I mean, come on. This is a workplace. It isn't designed for your vanity.
Newsflash. I've been here for 15 years. Headline, you have been here 1 day. End of story. You have no right to cancel my 15th anniversary party. End of story. End of story. End of story.
Hurt your feelings, or you do not agree with my methods, but it's over.
Okay.
One of my points, however, is that Bell's presence is completely consistent with the central premise of that the office shares with the Wire. That in a hierarchy, every employee rises to his or her level of incompetence. According to this premise, codified by the 1969 bestseller, The Peter Principle, people continue to be promoted until they acquire positions beyond their capabilities, where they then languish in their own incompetence. In time, every post tends to be occupied by an employee who is incompetent, the Peter Principle tells us, and work is accomplished by those employees who have not yet reached their level of incompetence. This is exactly what has happened to Michael Scott, Steve Carell, the glad-handing salesman whose disdain for details, complemented by a monomaniacal obsession with being liked, render him equally a successful salesman and an inept branch manager. That this is also true of Springer Bell becomes clearer when we notice how closely Michael's preference for performing the role of manager instead of managing resembles Bell's. Consider the proliferation of pointless meetings Michael calls, the ersatz formality with which he conducts them, the rules and orders and instructions honored more often in the breach, and always distinguished by their pointlessness. Compare these meetings to those run by Bell while Avon Barksdale is in prison, in which drug-dealing field captains must follow Robert's Rules of Order. You saw an example here. With Bell openly chastising these pushers and thugs when they deviate from those rules, for example, by attempting to speak before the chair has recognized them. In a moment typical of the office, Bell's folly becomes apparent when one of the captains, following Robert's rules, takes minutes. In other words, as Bell angrily points out, makes a formal record of a criminal conspiracy. This is among many signs that Bell has reached his level of incompetence. Breaking the chain of command, for example, he orders the prison hit on Barksdale's nephew D. He repeatedly gives large bribes to a Baltimore councilman for services never delivered, and he completely misunderstands the requirements of and process for renovating and selling downtown condos. The skills that made him successful in crime operations serve him poorly as a high-end real estate developer, just as his marketing courses adapt about as well to running a crime organization as Michael's night course in improv serves him in managing the office. In this regard, Bell and his operations are mirror images of the detectives, policemen, judges, DAs, and politicians ostensibly interested in putting him out of business. Thus, Bell can assassinate a witness against Barksdale's nephew because the political establishment would rather classify the act as random street violence than initiate the kind of investigation that must follow the murder of a witness, or embarrass the city, or put it under pressure to expand witness protection programs that the city cannot or does not want to fund. When a crime is not acknowledged, furthermore, the city's statistics improve. The fewer the crimes reported, the safer Baltimore is, statistically. So investigating crime makes the city less safe in the eyes of the public, and thus in the eyes of the elected officials and their subordinates, whose evaluations determine the efficacy of any office of the police department or any official individual officer. To a professional automaton, as the Peter Principle tells us, it is clear that means are more important than ends. The paperwork is more important than the purpose for which it was designed. He no longer sees himself as existing to serve the public. He sees the public as the raw material that serves to maintain him, the forms, the rituals, and the hierarchy. Axiomatic to both the Wire and the office, in other words, is the assumption that the Peter Principle is not simply about incompetent management, but about incompetent performances. If Springer Bell, in wanting to be Donald Trump, like Michael Scott in wanting to be Seinfeld or Carrot Top, thereby demonstrates he has reached his level of incompetence, it is because so too has Donald Trump, not to mention Carrot Top. Trump, in exchange for actual competence, his bad business decisions squandered his father's capital, has produced a mediated replica of the person he allegedly is. In this way, Trump typifies a phenomenon explicitly foregrounded by both The Wire and The Office. The competent inferiors and incompetent superiors that populate hierarchies also crave a cinematic identity, or more accurately, the cinematic fulfillment of the identity that they believe they already have. I'm just going to play a clip of Michael in that role, one of many.
What are those? Tell me, please.
Jelly beans.
No. They are not just ordinary jelly beans, little girl. These are extraordinary jelly beans.
The Willy Wonka golden ticket promotional idea is probably the best idea I've ever had. Probably the best idea anybody has ever had. 3 days ago, I slipped 5 pieces of gold paper into random paper shipments. This entitles the customer to 10% off of their total order. It will be a day for them that is full of whimsy and
Again, one could have picked almost any episode to find similar moments of Michael as performing Michael. The phenomenon I am describing may be illustrated by the fact that all of you secretly know at this very moment, while I am reading this paper, that you are the central character in the narrative, the one on whom the camera is chiefly focused, around whom all the shots are organized. You think that I am background in the scene in the movie of your life where you attend a lecture at Carnegie Mellon, whereas I know that you are mostly interchangeable extras, with a few featured character actors among you, in this movie about me. You don't believe me, of course, because you know the camera is on you and that the rest of us are extras. That is why, ever so often, you surreptitiously glance up to make contact with that camera lens and reaffirm the fact that the audience is yours. This phenomenon I call the eye of the camera, by which I mean the cinematic sense of a self that precedes concrete particulars or actual achievements. A secret stardom awaiting the narratives that will circumscribe its realms of accomplishment and of desire. A self created by the principles of cinema, even when the camera, as in The Office, is completely imagined. What I am arguing is that the style that represents The Office as the production of unidentified documentarians, ubiquitous and perennial, who combine unedited raw footage with talking head interviews, does not parody second-rate documentary, but all too accurately represents the conditions that constitute the characters' subjectivities. In other words, what makes them just like us, by which I mean ever striving, despite the consequences for ourselves and for others, to be the stars of our own incompetent lives. And this is a collection of clips where people surreptitiously glance at the camera.
I know you are. Knock.
You can fax it over. Yeah, fine. Yay. This can be okay. Just tell me to do it.
And then he'll be sure to give you a raise.
Looking at The Wire through this aspect of The Office thus makes clearer that the surveillance apparatus in the series is less about evidence than about the consciousness of performing before unidentified eyes and ears. In that often the surveillance images, for example, characters as seen through an elevated security camera, provide shots exclusively for the audience, because neither the image nor the perspective from which it is viewed is anchored to anything in the narrative. The characters are always mediated, these shots remind us, through the eyes of others. Thus, Police Major Rawls is concerned only about the number of cases his office clears, as that statistic represents his performance, regardless of the number of successful prosecutions those cases produce, indifferent to the effect that his office actually has on reducing crime or punishing criminals. Those are not his goals. Reducing crime, prosecuting criminals, enforcing the law are, to the contrary, factors that interfere with police work as he understands it, that is, as it reflects on his performance. Because, as the Peter Principle further explains, the competence of any employee is determined not by outsiders, but by his superior in the hierarchy. If the superior has reached his level of incompetence, he will probably rate his subordinates in terms of institutional values. In The Wire, therefore, those who disagree with major roles are thwarted and punished. Lieutenant Daniel's role as a husband is completely undermined by his failure to advance his own career, which is undermined by his insistence on doing good police work, something he subsequently gets over. Judge Phelan, who issues the orders for The Wire and the surveillance unit, as much because he is trying to promote his own career as because he wants to help Assistant District Attorney Rhonda Perlman, whom, in his words, he'd love to lay a fuck in, leaks information that serves his own ends at the expense of McNulty, whose pursuit of the Barksdale organization he has allegedly assisted. When it means he may be dropped from the party's re-election ticket, furthermore, Judge Phelan allows the operation to be undermined by a premature raid of a drug house. That raid is demanded by the acting police commissioner, Burrell, so as to put on a show for the press and the public that will cover up public embarrassment of his department and help solidify his permanent appointment to the post of police commissioner. These and numerous other comparable actions and relationships simply illustrate the Peter Principle's point that employees in a hierarchy do not really object to incompetence. They merely gossip about incompetence to mask their envy of employees who have pull. It may simply be fortuitous that actor Idris Elba's promotion from The Wire to The Office, that is from a show with a terminal run to one with an open run, from a sub rosa organization to a legitimate corporation, from a Baltimore headquarters to a New York headquarters, is a move between two shows that most overtly thematize the relationship of the Peter Principle, to what I have called the relationship of the Peter Principle to what I have called the eye of the camera. That promotion, nevertheless, suggests a homology, one that is symptomatic of the conditions of terror in this age of terrorism. If the consequences of mismanagement are more severe for Stringer Bell than for Michael Scott, I want to argue, the consequences for Homeland Security, if such a thing can be said to exist, suggested by the similarity of their behavior, constitute the quintessence of contemporary terrorism. I am not saying that we have more to fear from the office's aspiring branch manager, Dwight Schrute, who yearns to turn the office into a fascist dictatorship, and Angela, who runs the office's party committee with iron-handed rigidity, than from Al-Qaida or Kim Jong-il, now deceased. But rather, that what is truly terrifying is that the only protection from Al-Qaida is a rhizomatic network of agencies, now at 38,000 separate government and private agencies. 38,000 separate government and private agencies paid for by your tax dollars at very high prices. A rhizomatic network of agencies rendered by the Peter Principle and the eye of the camera, no more adept at doing anything than is the Scranton office of Dunder Mifflin and its alter egos in the echelons of Baltimore law enforcement and government. Consider these excerpts from a Time magazine article from October 4th, 2009. And the title of the article, "It's Official, the ATF and the FBI don't get along." I'm reading from the Time magazine article. In April 2005, sheriff's deputies reached a suburban Seattle home in time to prevent a firebomb from detonating. But there was nothing the sheriff's department could do to diffuse another volatile situation at the site. A feud between the explosive teams that showed up, including the FBI and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives, the ATF. Trouble at the scene emerged when FBI and ATF's explosive experts seemed to believe their own agencies should head the investigation. That fight for jurisdiction was a low point for federal agents in Seattle, part of a long-simmering national rivalry that has festered since Congress moved the ATF from the Treasury Department to the Department of Justice on September 11th. An audit found that the conflict has led to confusion at crime sites, arguments in front of state and local investigators, tit-for-tat recrimination, and even a threat from the FBI to arrest an ATF agent. Each agency trains separately and has its own explosives database and lab. Agents race to explosions to claim the lead in investigations, and some managers are unclear about jurisdiction. According to the audit, 2 ambiguous memos from 2004 and 2008 failed to clarify the relationship. One recent incident was on December 2008 when the agencies feuded over a Woodburn, Oregon bombing in which a device outside a bank killed a local bomb technician and a police chief. In June 2007, agents fought in front of state and local bomb squad personnel at a blast site in the Mojave Desert. The ATF claimed it was notified too late for agents to work the scene, while the FBI claimed that the ATF responded late, then wanted to take over the scene. Other recent incidents took place in Baltimore, Phoenix, New York City, and San Diego. The Space Shuttle Challenger catastrophe, it is widely conceded, was not a failure of technology, but of bureaucracy, of communication. The scientific data about the O-rings was as clear as was the procedure fuzzy for communicating that data such that it could play a cogent role in administrative decision-making. In all decision-making, people need to acquire the information they need. This is not rocket science. It's not that straightforward. Rather, it is an intricate and tortuous tapestry of competing, inflected interests, rhizomatic and prolific. The attempt to unravel the decisions and procedures that allowed the 9/11 attacks to succeed revealed an uncomfortable kinship between the highest levels of American intelligence and the pettiest foibles of the workers in the office. Lost by the wire, the United States intelligence community and the Office of Homeland Security become the agents of the failed security state of which Baltimore becomes a microcosm. That state is besieged not by enemy assault, but by hundreds of offices and office workers uncomfortably exposed equally in the office and in the federal government's attempt to make the nation more secure by fabricating weapons of mass destruction, ignoring the fragile levees in New Orleans, and installing enhanced security measures at a petting zoo in Indiana. When put in juxtaposition with 9/11 and with the office, the wire demonstrates the relentless conflation of the terrorist and the terrorized, forever confused and ensnared by quotidian procedures that create and undermine their agency. In this context, we can see the first 2 seasons of The Wire, which premiered less than 9 months after September 11th, as engaging the compounding bureaucratic failures that led up to the attack and followed from it. A running motif in The Wire's 2nd season, for example, involves a dispute between several separate law enforcement bureaus and jurisdictions actively and vehemently trying to avoid acknowledging the murder of 13 women, whose suffocated corpses were found in a large shipping bin on the Baltimore docks, or responsibility for investigating the crime or any interest in prosecuting the offenders. This argument comes to a head when it appears that the investigation of the crime may expose an international drug smuggling and slave prostitution ring at the expense of building up a case against the union leader Frank Sabatka. The investigation of that case was initiated as a pure act of persecution by Southeastern District Police Major Valchek because he had had a personal run-in with Sabatka over whether the local police or the local longshoremen would be able to donate a stained glass window to a specific site in a local Catholic church. Valchek is opposed to solving murders or breaking up crime rings if it will interfere with his vendetta against Sabatka, who might otherwise be a valuable witness.
Gratian is holding the girls, and the madam who has legal residency. We cut loose after she goes to bed.
Try to interview them, see if anyone will roll.
Not while the taps are off. Better let them think it was a random raid and see what gets said on the wire today.
Cut to the chase. You any closer on my murders?
If these are the people who were importing those girls, then yeah, we're closer. The more we learn, the more chance we have to clear those cases.
What about Frank Sabatka? I'm not hearing his name in here anywhere.
The union may be involved in the smuggling, but we're not getting a sense that it goes past that.
This is about Frank Sabatka.
The case is bigger now.
Look, Missy, this is my detail. I started it. Now I'm asking, do you have charges on Frank Sabatka?
Charging Sabatka at this point would lose us the wire and a chance at the real targets.
He is the real target.
Patience, Dan. I'm sure if they bring
You
the
owe me
case.
on this, Irv.
You asked for a detail, I gave you a detail. You asked for Daniels, I gave you Daniels.
So, now the votes are in and you're moving your damn golf trophies upstairs to the commissioner's office? Now you're freezing me out, huh? Fucking rat fuckers, all of you. This is my case. Mine. And now you're gonna tell me who the target is? Well, not fucking likely.
In the end of the second season, as in the end of the first, petty goals and prolific incompetence take back seat in the failure to close down the large-scale corruption and crime operations, to the involvement of the federal agencies which explicitly cite post 9/11 protocols as the reason they are not interested in pursuing more extensive investigation or prosecution. One could argue that the same kind of thinking that produced the counterproductive protocols, produced the event that produced the protocols, and produced the analysis of the event that called for new protocols while covering up responsibility for the protocols that made new protocols necessary. This is not surprising in that the 9/11 Commission report was authored by Philip Zelikow, who, prior to his role as executive director of the commission, had administered the Bush transition team's demotion of the NSA unit tracking al-Qaida. Richard Clarke's colleagues believed, New York Times reporter Philip Shannon explains, that Zelikow's reorganization had all but guaranteed that the White House would pay little attention to the flood of terrorist warnings in the months before 9/11. Zelikow has also subsequently written the report that provided the philosophical underpinning for the Bush doctrine of preemptive strike. All of this information was withheld from the commission when Zelikow interviewed for his job. Exercising iron-fisted, often brutal control over the commission staff, Zelikow was able, to the dismay and anger of many of the staffers, to suppress all aspects of the report critical of Bush, and especially Condoleezza Rice, with whom Zelikow had previously co-authored a book, whose performance as NSC director leading up to 9/11, many staffers believed was categorically incompetent. Zelikow also convinced Commission Chair Thomas Keane, who liked the popular history genre, he was proud of his master's degree in the teaching of history, that the report should be written for the general public. It is not surprising in this light that Zelikow added to the staff Alexis Albion, an expert in espionage and counter-espionage. That is, fictional espionage and counter-espionage. Her recent history dissertation, Harvard history dissertation, focused on the public image of James Bond in the mid-1960s. The failure of the report's protocols and or the officers that followed them and or the agencies that coordinate those officers has received recent attention, or now, not so recent now, it has received attention in light of the Christmas Day attempt of Umar Farouk Abdulmuttalib to blow up Northeast Airline Flight 253, in which he succeeded only in setting his crotch on fire. Viewed through the wire, viewed through the office, the issue is much more complex or frightening than finding out who screwed up or who or what will make us safe. Questions raised about the management of data suggest that the information about Abdulmuttalib was available, but that the processing failed. Successful process and retrieval procedures should have resembled those seen regularly on the television show 24, where computer whizzes, keyboards rattling like machine guns, solve complex programming, hacking, debugging, and retrieval problems in a real-time span, 1/10 of that which it would take Bill Gates to book a single flight on Expedia. That this magical mastery of bits and bytes and pixels, of applications and data, of keyboards and keywords, provides the fiction that informs the public's image of security may be one reason the National Counterterrorism Center outside Washington, D.C. was designed with help from the Walt Disney Corporation. This center houses the Terrorist Identities Data Mart Environment, or TIDE, containing data on around 550,000 terrorist suspects. The point of the Tide database, an official speaking to the New York Times said, is to make sure even the most minor suspicious details are recorded so that they can be connected to new data in the future. But if all these details and suspects were given equal attention, then none of them would get the attention necessary for effective interdiction. Greater sharing of information, moreover, would only add more data to the system, in effect doubling the size of the haystack hiding the needles. More information takes longer to sort, produces more invidious variables, and creates more confusion. The Christmas Day bomber thus evoked demands for a system simultaneously more vast and more streamlined. This contradiction has been evaded by repeated evocation of the metaphor of a child's game. According to President Obama, the US government had sufficient information, but our intelligence community failed to connect the dots, which is closer to a 19th century than a 21st century way to produce a clear picture. According to Newsweek, a frustrating stumbling block to detecting the Christmas Day bomber was that, quote, different agencies have different levels of secrecy, thwarting communication between them. Formal officials were scathing in their judgments of the intelligence community's performance. The system should have been lighting up like a Christmas tree, said Ali Soufan, a former senior FBI counterterrorism agent who spent 7 years tracking al-Qaida, suspects in Yemen, and often battled with the CIA over information sharing. Francis Fragos Townsend, President Bush's chief Homeland Security advisor, put most of the blame on the analysts at the National Counterterrorism Center for not pushing the system for more information on Abdul Muttalib. It was the NCTC's responsibility to connect the dots, she said, and asked for additional dots if they didn't have enough. The same complaint followed both recent shootings of policemen in Seattle, the shooting at Virginia Tech, and the Times Square bomber. These were all now a few years ago. While all of these events also merit detailed scrutiny, I have time to look at just one. On November 5, 2009, Major Nadel Hassan, an Army psychiatrist, entered the Soldiers Readiness Center at Fort Hood and opened fire, killing 13 and wounding 30. Senator Joe Lieberman had called for hearings to determine whether agencies, quote, missed signals or failed to connect the dots. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates then announced a Pentagon review of the shootings at Fort Hood to help ensure, he said, that nothing like this ever happens again. That review, Time magazine tells us, quote, will try to find gaps in procedures for identifying service members who pose a threat to others. Arguably a curious objective for an institution whose job it is to teach people to pose threats to others. Could anyone get elected in any country by promising to develop a military that posed no threats? And particularly under the Cheney-Bush doctrine of preemptive strike, isn't a threatening military a cornerstone of the war on terror? Donald Rumsfeld is on record as having said that Iraq was chosen for retaliation after 9/11, quote, not because Iraq was believed to have anything to do with the attacks, but simply because it had better targets. And many, long after the failure to discover the weapons of mass destruction, Iraq WMDs, continued to justify the invasion on the basis that it was selected randomly to teach the Arab or Muslim world a lesson. At the same time, one of the dots was the fact that Hassan believed this. That is, that, quote, he gave a talk, quoting Time magazine, he gave a talk about the war on terror being a war on Islam. Perhaps one reason Hassan felt this way is because it was true. According to a sworn affidavit by a former employee of Blackwater, the largest U.S. mercenary force in Iraq, its founder, Eric Pierce, quote, this was in the sworn affidavit, views himself as a Christian crusader, eliminated Muslims and the Islamic faith from the globe. To that end, Mr. Prince deployed to Iraq certain men who shared his vision of Christian supremacy. Mr. Prince operated his companies in a manner that encouraged and rewarded the destruction of Iraqi life. It is also argued that the military should have taken more note of Hassan's strong religious convictions. At one point, one of his classmates reports that he indicated religious law took precedence over the U.S. Constitution. If Hassan required FBI scrutiny because he believed religion trumped the Constitution, shouldn't the agency also be keeping an eye on the former Alabama Justice Roy Moore, who refused to remove a statue of the Ten Commandments from his courthouse because he explained it's about whether or not you can acknowledge God as a source of our law and our liberty. Shouldn't it have been following Scott Roeder, whose religious conviction motivated him to shoot and kill Kansas abortion Dr. George Tiller? Clearly, there are many identical dots that need connecting. In any case, according to Mark Thompson at the time, the reason, quote, the army looked the other way regarding Hassan's religious conviction, it has been charged, was that, quote, because Hassan was a Muslim. Because the army was taking into account his religion, in other words, they failed to take into account his religion. Expressing an understanding of military procedure straight out of the Peter Principle, one officer told Time, quote, people are afraid to come forward and challenge somebody's ideology because they're afraid of getting an equal opportunity complaint that can end careers. Close quote. The data shows, moreover, that Hassan's training record was not good. Poor attendance, test scores lower than expected, consistent lateness, not seeing enough patients, allowing a homicidal patient to escape the emergency room. That should suggest something. Missing a night shift and inappropriately discussing religious topics with patients. Lawrence Korb, the Pentagon personnel chief during the Reagan administration, claimed to be, quote, perplexed by the reports that Hassan received poor evaluations and still got promoted. According to NPR reporter Daniel Zordling, quote, these concerns could have made Hassan unemployable in civilian life. Another one of the dots that should have predicted Hassan's rage against the military, in other words, is the fact that the Army was the only institution that would reward his job performance. I'm reminded at this point of Sirhan, the person who assassinated Bobby Kennedy. By California state law, he comes up for a parole hearing every 10 years. And just about 10 years ago, I think 11, he came up for a hearing. And at the hearing, he said that if Bobby Kennedy were alive, he would support Sirhan's parole. About which comedian Paula Poundstone said, what bad luck. The only guy who would have supported his parole, and he shot him. So it's the same thing. The only, here we have the only organization that would have promoted him, so he shot them. Obviously, all these criteria. Even the fact that Hassan was in email correspondence with Middle East radicals or terrorists could not have predicted this event. Would that it could. Just as the circumstances related to Abdul Muttalib could not have predicted his actions. The most important dot in his case, the one that connected the other dots, was his attempt to blow up the plane. This was an important sign that he intended to engage in terrorist activities. Yet another position in the blame game that the public has been cautioned against playing in the wake of 9/11, of Katrina, of the Iraq War, and of all these shootings, cautioned especially by those who share in the blame, is that the dots were not to be found in the data, but in immediate behavior. Abdul Muttalib paid in cash. As is often the case in countries like Nigeria, which have unstable banking systems and shaky economies. And he had a one-way ticket, as is often the case when people want to leave countries like Nigeria with unstable banking systems and shaky economies. And he had no luggage, as is often the case with people who have no luggage. In this attempt, in this argument, personal interrogation replaces an accurate database, a perfect retrieval system, or efficient information sharing, suggesting that perhaps we should return to the variant on the obsolete routine questions they used to ask at airports, and still do in Europe, by the way. Did you pack your own underwear? Were you given a suppository by a stranger? Because had he answered those honestly, we would have caught him. Whether or not these questions will help us connect the dots, we should remember that connecting the dots is done at one's own risk, as The Wire makes clear. At the end of the first season, virtually every person who attempted to curtail the drug traffic or build a case against the Barksdale crime family organization is personally worse off for having done so. The point then is that the state of the state is uncannily close to the state of the offices of the state and the county and city agencies that make the state as secure as any state office or the state of any office. If this portends ill for Homeland Security, in that the people managing that branch of our state are not much different from the branch offices of Dunder Mifflin, the only comfort that might ease our state of mind is the likelihood that Al-Qaeda's regional offices and branch managers are no different than Dunder Mifflin's, as is illustrated by Osama bin Laden's most prominent subordinate, George Bush, whose assignment it was to prove true bin Laden's claim that the US had military designs on the Middle East, and to provide public statements verifying that these designs were mandated by a religious cause. Al-Qaeda assignments that President George II carried out prolifically and with startling dispatch. Finally, it was Al-Qaeda's branch manager, George II, who created the greatest of all credit default swaps by producing a $1 trillion plus US war debt that guaranteed a 100 million% return on bin Laden's $500,000 9/11 investment. A formidable accomplishment that, we can only hope, will be matched in its level of incompetence by Al-Qaeda's other officers. If not, no state is safe. Thank you.
We definitely have time for questions. Should we get some more lights?
Yeah. Well, good. Oh, the lights on.
It's on the screen, yeah.
The light is over here. Lights, hold on. Yeah. Oh,
Hi, Alan. Hi. I was fascinated by your juxtaposition of those two shows, and but I was very uneasy with your reading. And the reason why I was uneasy was because of two movements. The first move, I mean, I'm sympathetic. It seems to me you're motivated by a certain rage at Bushism, okay, or the Bush government, right? But the thing is, the two things that you do is, one, you take a broad analogy of these two texts, and you almost make them in place of, or you make them take the place of empirical evidence to prove bureaucracies are wrong. So it seems to me a certain kind of cultural studies reading that you take text to be analogous, if not homologous, to what goes on empirically. Right.
Oh, I see what you mean, yeah.
And then
that's not what I'm doing, but if it looks that way, that's a problem. Okay,
the second step is it seems to me finally that you come down. I might share your anger at Bush government, but it finally seems to me you come down with a sort of Tea Party solution that you attack bureaucracy. Maybe I didn't hear your argument right, but it seems to me you're endorsing the anti-bureaucratic view by taking the Peter principle as an accurate account of these empirical evidences. I would pose, contrary to that, there was, if you remember, like 20 years before maybe more than that, The Godfather was taken as a model of American business, and there's still texts now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even there are super spies who are very, very proficient. They're like positive bureaucracies. And The Godfather, I don't know what would be the other, The Godfather would substitute, I think, for The Wire. In that, there are models of positive bureaucracies, but I would also hold out
that it's not an empirical case,
positive bureaucracies.
Well, let's try and flip it. Let's try and flip the argument, because certainly, let's go to the Tea Party one first, because I think we can agree that my membership in the Tea Party is long expired. I think it's good. That rather than say I'm endorsing their position itself is incoherent, and it draws on a number of themes that are pervasive in our culture, and that's how it stirs up anger. But when they try to present a coherent position, so indeed, the overlap is not because I'm endorsing their position, but because they're drawing on certain critiques and then trying to turn them into some sort of coherent message, which is totally incoherent. That would come in a much longer, different talk. So I think that's what the thing is. It's hardly by saying, yeah, government is bad. In fact, I have a lot to say about why John Kerry never stood up to George Bush about the values of good judgment, government. I think he could have won the second debate had he done that. So it's not that I have a problem with that. Now going to the other one, there are huge problems in bureaucracy in our country. And they work in institutions, and I think the Peter Principle, which was, a huge bestseller in its moment, but, it's sort of fallen out of public discourse, needs to be taken seriously. I looked at it when it first came out, but ended up rereading it from cover to cover, and it really makes a lot of telling points about how bureaucracies, even when they're well-intentioned, function poorly. And the reason it does is not because everyone in a bureaucracy is incompetent. As it says, the work is being done by the people who haven't reached their level of incompetence. And there are often a large number of people doing that, working for their promotions, doing that, and compensating for the people who are giving them orders and instructions. And I think that, if you reread the Peter Principle, it's kind of a very interesting thing. The Peter Principle is almost an example of the Peter Principle in publishing. It was a huge bestseller. I mean, it made a fortune. It was rejected by 18 companies or publishers, and the reports were interesting. The readers' reports that came in about it were interesting. They came in two kinds of reports. One said he should make it funnier. If this is a parody or something, there aren't enough jokes. And the other said he shouldn't be joking about something this serious. And he got both of these things from the editors who were each covering their own ass and answering their own bosses. And finally, when it came out, it is sometimes humorous, but it is a rather telling description of what happens. And we see this particularly in public offices when people almost invariably run for another office. It is with a different job description. That is to say, a state senator may run for governor. One's an administrative post, one's a legislative post, and so on. A senator may run for president. And we see this over and over again, that people who do certain jobs very well then take on a whole new job. Otherwise, it's not a promotion, it's just a lateral shift, So this upward process happens. In certain areas, and this is what Eisenhower, whom looks better and better in terms of talking about bureaucracies, warned us about, the military-industrial complex speech, but it was the general, he was willing to slash the military budget. What has happened is that people have gotten terribly afraid of touching certain areas. I said there was the New York Times article about the 38,000, and these are very well-paid people by and large. They didn't experience the recession, they didn't experience anything, they lived in their own bubble. Agencies. Nobody in cutting budgets will even go down to 37,999 because if that one is eliminated and something happens, they're afraid that it'll be blamed on eliminating that one thing, and it has become a kind of prolific industry. It is clearly filled with redundancy and all kinds of problems. And the example of the Homeland Security budget in the second year protecting a petting zoo in Indiana, as opposed to the chemical refineries on the Jersey coast just outside of New York City, which have never been. Corzine came in and said, there's nobody protecting these. They could blow these up with a truck bomb and the toxic fumes would wipe out Lower Manhattan. And the whole committee passed it unanimously, and then they went back to their lobbyists and they wouldn't even bring it up again. It never got out of committee. So there are huge problems, and these the Tea Party may tap on it. What I'm saying is that these shows thematize it, and when we put them together, we put together things that they're not proving the case, they're simply articulating it. We put together shows that would be ostensibly different, and notice the similarities. They help highlight the similarities. They're not the same, they're different, but there are things in them, the absurdities, when we put Stringer Bell, Robert's Rules of Order moments next to Michael's meetings, we all of a sudden realize that this is not a guy who gives this aura of supercompetence, which he seems to do in the show, but really is reached his level of incompetence, that he has these aspirations of a certain sort. So the juxtaposition is not to prove the argument, so when you say as if giving evidence, but rather to say these shows thematize it and enable us to think about this problem of production. And certainly then when we take it back, and I can only skim the surface, I have a whole other chapter, which also has been published on the 9/11 Commission report, which I write about it as postmodern pastiche. And it's really not just corrupt, although it is corrupt, but it's obscene in many ways. That'd be a whole other lecture. So these things, we start to, by thinking about postmodern fiction and applying it there, we can start to zero in on some of the problems, not to prove the case, but to highlight them. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's David.
So, does The Wire or The Office have a take on this problem in your view?
Which is this problem? this case.
The Peter Principle, the
Oh, I
failure
think
of
I think
bureaucracy.
The Wire, the makers of The Wire, whether they, I'm sure they read the Peter Principle, even if they haven't read it, they are certainly describing that same phenomenon. I mean, episode after episode is almost an illustration of how people are more interested in the criteria to evaluate their job than to achieving the end. I mean, literally, I truncated it because I could show clips from it forever. But the whole thing about 13 dead people in a bin on the dock, and no one wants to investigate the crime. No one wants to even call it a crime because it'll screw up their statistics.
So you would say then that The Wire has a critical attitude with respect to this problem.
Oh yeah, I think the makers have been on record with that too.
Because it wasn't entirely clear from your talk, and I think it would make a somewhat more effective use of the show as itself having an argument about this rather than merely illustrating it.
Yeah. But I certainly agree with that. Yeah, absolutely.
So I was wondering, have you ever seen Homicide?
I did. I didn't see. Yeah, I saw some of it. I saw episodes of it. Yeah, I've seen it, but I'm not an expert
I'm just
on it.
bringing that up because, directed by the same guy who directed The Wire, right, David Simon, and it seems like, it could be the same police office in Baltimore, right? I mean, so many of the same problems in terms of bureaucracy, police work, get brought up in that show, and they really highlight it there, but it seems like it's not a novel theme in police drama. It seems like it's in fact one of the more common ones in...
Well, it's not a, no, I don't agree. Although certainly I wouldn't say, this is the only show that ever showed incompetence in it, that's of course. But I would not say it is a common theme. And the first thing is, sure there are similarities in Homicide. And again, I didn't see as much of that as I saw. I saw a couple of seasons, I got kind of bored with it because it seemed to be constantly about interrogating people in rooms, which finally, same thing was happening with the NYPD Blue. You'd have an initial event and then people yell at people in a room for a while. So it's, I didn't, and I also was not wild about the strange jump cutting they did, which I guess they thought was interesting. But anyway, so I talk about it with, there may be overlaps, but they were very clear that they were making the makers different. And people say, if you're going to Tremians looking for The Wire in New Orleans, don't. It's not. And we don't want to say the same thing. We want to look at different things. They are committed to a certain notion of realism. And certainly The Wire is more committed to a certain notion of realism than Homicide. And there are a number of reasons of that which have to do with the structure of a television series. One of the things that the Wire people did was they were very emphatic, although they didn't hold to it as much as they should have, but they were very emphatic about each series not being the same people over and over again. But then, of course, at the end of the first season, you should have presumed that everybody, that Kima will never walk again, that McNulty will spend the rest of his life on this boat, and they find an artificial reason to bring back the same people to some degree. But having said that, in general, they make a strong commitment not to follow certain prescriptions of the television series. Also, the number of episodes per season, the number of episodes they devote to a topic, so that they were looking to explore a topic as opposed to create the kind of coherent season that people in the history of television have turned on every week. So they were already looking for what they felt was a version of realism more consistent with being able to do a kind of almost journalistic essay. Well, it's not, but you know what I mean. As opposed to Homicide, which wants people to turn in the next week and next week something. So there were overlaps, but the quality of The Wire in terms of its attitude toward competence and bureaucracy, maybe there's another series that is as cynical. I don't see it. Hill Street Blues, I mean, if we talk about the history of this genre, Hill Street Blues, NYPD Blue, I'm not sure which shows.
I mean, I was just thinking, it seems like it's a kind of common trope for police dramas to bring in the FBI or something and have there be an argument about whose jurisdiction is, like the X-Files, things like this. I mean, it seems like that's a...
Bad too has a lot.
Yeah,
well,
like
Breaking Bad,
built-in
perhaps
drama.
this is a newer series, and I think we are in an age. And maybe, this is the same thing, we go back to what the Tea Party is tapping in. We are in an age of a great deal of cynicism about the competence of government and Breaking Bad. I've only seen some episodes. I'm gonna get my box set and watch it through because it's hard for me to come in the middle of things. But sure, we're seeing more of this stuff. Sure, jurisdiction battles show up, but that's not, the jurisdiction battle here is not as much the issue as the reason why the federal governments aren't interested. They're not battling for jurisdiction. Actually, they want the FBI and they want the federal stuff. And the FBI says, no, our job evaluation is only, if we can connect it to tracking terrorism. So we don't care about international drug smuggling and 13 dead women. So they back out. It works actually the opposite way in this. It's not a turf battle like the one between the ATF and the thing.
Can you say more maybe about the eye of the camera concept and thinking about, because I feel like the cynicism shows up, and this is an unformulated question, but it's sort of asking what does one do, right? So you sort of end up with this cynicism in the face of all this bullshit and bureaucracy, right? You sort of, which I think you sort of get the cynical, well, let's just tear it down, smaller government. Just do away with it. But I wonder how the eye of the camera
that takes us back to Jeff's comment that I sounded. That does take Jeff's comment that I sound more like a Tea Party person than I would like to. I don't know. I don't know the answer. I feel that there are so serious problems in government and elections and democracy in the United States, and I'm very troubled by them. I don't agree with the Tea Party about what they are, but I'm very troubled by them, and I don't have it. And I think that I'm not alone in feeling this anxiety and trouble, and I think a lot of shows are thematized of it. The eye of the camera is a formal issue, and it relates to a lot of work I've done, which has to do, let me see if I can just give you a kind of Cliff Notes version. It has to do with the fact, and we talked about this over lunch, that if you go through a set of formal procedures regularly enough to naturalize them, examples like keyboarding, driving a car, playing a musical instrument, where you really have mastered these things well enough, as when you're driving a car, to carry on a conversation, tune the radio, do the thing, and still be awake. That you are occupying a subject position, and that subject position that you keep rehearsing has an effect on the way you understand and perceive the world. Specifically, I'm very interested, and I have to say these models are changing, but I'm talking about a certain generation, a certain time, when the tenets, the formal procedures of watching classical Hollywood cinema had us occupying subject positions that created a certain sense of the world and of identity. And I say they are changing because more and more people are growing up with their monitor in front of them. They might be watching a movie, one thing, and looking at Facebook and doing all kinds of other things. And I don't have a theory or an idea about that. But I'm talking about a certain sense of habituating the idea that life is like a movie. And I don't just mean thematically, but I mean formally. The formal process of putting yourself in the limited omniscient position of watching a classical Hollywood film, which is basically the same compositional form as TV films. Again, Homicide violated that with jump cuts, but more generally, and I'm talking about the average baby boomer by the time he or she was 16 had watched something like 16,000 hours of television. Which I know, some of you do this in a weekend, but I just, basically, that's a lot of practice and I do think that we do hold, every human being, but there is a tendency to hold a cinematic notion of oneself. And I know that some people have written about The Office as, as with the British Office, of parodying these documentarians who come in there and the talking heads on this. And it certainly has that angle. But I think for me, it seems more to describe the sense, I can't be the only person who carries on conversations with someone who isn't there The famous, the classic example is the elevator comment you have after the interview, the answer you would have given to the guy. Everyone talks about that. You go, but all of these things, the thing you would have said or should have said or want to say, and there's a sense of this being almost a performance, not just simply a thought, but a performance. That we're in a society where we see the world as mediated cinematically and televisually, and television is a different model. So, but it often has film in it, and that sense is one where I think we have a cinematic notion of ourselves, and I think that can lead to a lot of social and political positions. Have I worked them all out? No, but I am concerned about that. I am concerned about the idea that somehow. Well, I'll give you one example. The Iraq, there was no plan for the occupation of Iraq. I could talk at great length about that and the occupation of Japan. I'm not going to. I'm only going to say that the kinds of quotes that came out of Cheney were, and Rumsfeld, we gave them freedom, that's enough. What they had in mind was the cinematic ending of a war, not the political and military ending of a war. Do you think you could occupy Pittsburgh without any plan, dismissing all of the police and all the people who work for the government in one fell swoop and said, we have democracy, you work it out? It was this notion of they'll be throwing flowers. We have liberated them. They had conflated the notion of liberation with the notion of conquest. We liberated France. We didn't liberate Germany in World War II. We conquered them. It's just that simple. And we had to occupy them. And these plans took years upon years upon years of detailed planning. The first Asian Studies Institutes in the United States were set up at places like Northwestern and Harvard, or and Yale, Duke, I think. The minute Pearl Harbor occurred, because it was presumed, not that our occupation was perfect, but it was presumed that we had to plan these things, because it wasn't going to end like a movie. It was going to end like a military operation. And the totally cinematic notion of, we would come in, we'd walk into Baghdad, we'd liberate the place, and people would be throwing flowers, and that'll be it, and then we'd go. But it was built on this kind of bizarre movie notion of the world. Can I say that this happened because Bush and Rumsfeld and Cheney watched too many movies? I don't know, of course not. But I am concerned about the general way in which subjectivity is structured for Americans and possibly people through the world by the experience, the formal experience of watching a certain style of movie. I hope that answers the question or answers it satisfactorily.
How does it, so it's part of the problem that, part of this, how does it connect to bureaucracy? So
because it connects to everything, but they're concerned with the performance. In other words, they're thinking of themselves as the performance, and their superior is their audience. Not, did we get these people arrested, but how is my performance measured by my superior? Do I look like I'm this? Do I look like I'm doing my job? And again, I can't give you statistically, but anybody who's been in academia, which is where I spent most of my life, or probably any other kind of hierarchy, have certainly encountered a lot of people wanting to look like they're doing their job more than do their job. I mean, I don't know if there are any deans in this room, but just,
Actually, I think that helps. I want to ask you a more general question, but I think that helps pinpoint. I think my difference with you is I think that you see the Bush years as a failure of bureaucracy. I see it actually not as a failure of bureaucracy, but a victory of the lobbyists you mentioned before, or the profiteers.
Why are those mutually exclusive?
Or of private enterprises that were public, because a lot of people like BlackRock are fabulously wealthy after it, very successful. But anyway, what I was going to ask you, but I think you did put your finger on the crisis of meritocracy rather than the failure of to phrase it a little differently. I mean, obviously these two shows, it's not that unusual in a comedy, but it is more unusual in a drama. Because Homicide, they're finally successful. They're actually good.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. And that's part of the mandate of having a weekly series of a certain sort.
But they both do uncannily seem to hit the crisis of meritocracy. So, and I would put that more as the public. So do you see any other text, or how does that, you see that as a general? Well,
I mean, let's just start with, that would just be a rephrasing. I don't think it's inconsistent with the Peter Principle. I think it would just be a rephrasing of it.
But right now there is.
And I don't see, I don't see how the what was the distinction you made about the Bush administration? Yes, the lobbyists, the triumph of the lobbyists. I don't see how that isn't, because all of the regulatory agencies and groups and watchdogs that were supposed to do their job instead answered to and in many cases people who were hired by the Bush administration who clearly wanted to, like that guy who was the head of FEMA, Brown, looked like he was doing a job, but instead of doing the job. So, one of the nice things about Obama is he hired someone who had not yet reached his level of incompetence, or he's still at a level of competence. Now, do I see other texts? I don't know where we are. I think Breaking Bad, from what I know of it, would be certainly a
Well,
good.
he's really competent in the trend.
Well, it's true, competent at making meth, right? Yeah.
The DEA agent brother-in-law is supposed to
Well, I've seen.
There's a novel by
What?
somebody named Sam Lipsyte called The Ass. And it's about a guy who's a total fuck up. He loses his job as a fundraiser for a university, and he bumbles through things. And it's not like comedic; it's painful to read. But I would say that that's the crisis of meritocracy.
Well, I'm sure they exist. I would believe that we would see many symptoms, whether I find them or not, of the same cultural narrative. It's symptomatic. I think these foreground, as I say, I don't want to say these shows prove it, but they simply foreground that issue, which I think the Tea Party does too, unfortunately, but in a very problematic and incoherent and destructive way. Yeah.
So when you were talking about this meritocracy problem, like in The Wire, I've never really watched it, but there's there's clearly those two officers who are attempting to solve the problem. They really want to go after these people who killed the 13 women. So my question is, do you think these rogue agents, almost like these people who are functioning inside of bureaucracy at their level of competence, they haven't quite reached that level? Is it their responsibility to be fixing the situation? Who's
Well, are you asking my opinion, or are you saying what the show's take on it is?
I'm asking you, but you see a lot of cop movies with a rogue cop, he's like, damn what the commissioner says, I don't care what the consequences are. Is it his responsibility?
I think we would have to look at the specific historical moment to see how those rogue cops are treated or valorized. I just saw the movie Flight this weekend, which is extremely problematic. It's too long for me to get into, but I don't have time to get into problems with it. But there's a question there of valorizing or punishing, and it's an extremely problematic movie in several ways. So specifically at various moments, in the way that Clint Eastwood is valorized in a certain way. McNulty in The Wire, it's very interesting, at a certain moment, even though he is pushing, because he looks like the guy who wants to get the Barksdale crime family, does, at a certain very crucial moment he says, it was all about me. In other words, he acknowledges it was more about his ego than even he, and and he's an alcoholic as well. There's nobody in there that, in The Wire's view of things, as it represents it, really does the job because they do the job well, and it's their job, and they want to do this job because they have you do not find it, and you find that the rare moments when that surfaces, it makes their lives extremely problematic. We could read and look, one of the people who's the most competent is a very, yeah.
It's not quite true, Al.
Which one?
The woman.
Which one?
The lesbian woman. Kima, yeah. She certainly is utterly.
Well, I would say
her
never
job.
being able to walk again, which is really the situation. She's almost killed in the first episode and first season, and looks like she'll never walk again. Second of all, she is in a faithful relationship, and McNulty teaches her how to cheat on her partner who has a baby. He says, look, you use the thing, you call your partner, she's cheating on her. And she learns this. She actually has discussions with McNulty about how did you get away with this. Yeah. So
I didn't say she was perfect. I said she was devoted to her job.
I said, yeah, no, well, she is devoted to aspects of her job, absolutely. So is Lester.
Yeah.
But Lester spends 12 years in the property thing. But I said it makes it at those moments when they do, life gets problematic for them. And I think that's, so there are the moments when people do. McNulty, everybody, Daniels, all of them their life is worse for doing their job well because it means opposing the people above them who have a vested interest not in their doing it well, but in making them look good.
Yeah.
And that's all I'm saying.
We have time for one more question.
So that would kind of indicate that these people who are just trying to do it for, the good of the job. They don't really, maybe they do want to fix it, but they don't have the power or the ability within that system.
Well, that would be the view of the Wire, and I think the question that Jeff is raising, or maybe all of you are raising, is, isn't there some way government can work well and do this? And I don't know. I think we are at a horrible crisis, and I think we could point to things like Citizens United. Well, yeah, it didn't buy the presidency and it didn't buy some Senate races, but it certainly has corrupted a money system in profound ways, and it certainly has made a lot of people rich by doing heinous things. I'm at a not optimistic. There's Cornel West. I don't know if it originated with him, but I certainly have heard him say it many times. He said, "You have to be hopeful, but you can't always be optimistic." He makes it. It's important to be hopeful, and I guess I'm hopeful, but I'm not always optimistic. Of course, I didn't expect Obama to win this election. I expected the forces of evil to triumph. I mean evil.
Nate Silver?
What?
Weren't you reading Nate Silver?
I was reading Nate Silver, and I was hoping he was right, and it's what we say, inviting the Kinahara or attempting the cosmic fly swatter. You don't ever think, you grow up, don't ever, take the, but I was literally a nervous wreck. I'm this visiting scholar at Ohio State, so I'm staying won't say motel during the week and go back to Lexington. So I went over to my friend Jimmy Phelan's house just because I couldn't bear to watch this alone. And I came in, I was almost, by 9 o'clock, I'm driving over there, and I'm afraid to turn the radio on, I'm afraid to turn it off. But that's just a matter of my personal psychology. I don't know what the state of the world is. If I said, yeah, things are getting better, or no, they're getting worse, it wouldn't mean it. That's how and I'm not good at predictions. I'm better at analysis than predictions. I'm not very good at it. But I think there are some profound problems, and I think the first thing we can do is acknowledge them and look at them, and Jeff couldn't be more right about the big moneyed interests that have profiteered in the Bush administration even more than in other administrations, and certainly the aerospace industry was ripping the country off for 40 years, ever since Eisenhower left office, basically. So, Well, thank you very much. Thank you for all the questions.